Thank you all for joining us this evening. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to our lecture with Rabbi David Saperstein, who will be speaking on The Golden Age of American Jewry is Not Over, Defending Democracy in Turbulent Times. In recent years, many of us have felt the world becoming more uncertain and divided. Challenges to civility, safety, and mutual understanding affect our communities. Rabbi Saperstein will help us reflect on how we can respond to these challenges and how we can strengthen our communities, uphold our principles, and contribute to a society where everyone can thrive. A special thank you to Edie and Art Hessel for generously sponsoring this program. We also extend our gratitude to Andrew R. Ammerman for sponsoring our Fall 2025 lecture series. Andrew dedicates this semester's learning in loving memory of Josephine and H. Max Ammerman and Stephen C. Ammerman. To those of you who have donated to the Haberman Institute, thank you. Your generosity makes it possible for us to offer meaningful lectures on Jewish thought, history, and culture free of charge. If you haven't contributed yet, we encourage you to consider donating after the program. Every gift, large or small, helps sustain our mission. For more information on how to get involved, please visit our website. As always, feel free to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. Rabbi Saperstein welcomes questions that offer a diversity of perspectives and challenges. At the same time, kindly keep your questions concise and in complete sentences. We will address them at the end of the lecture, though you can submit them at any point during the presentation. This lecture is being recorded and will be available on our website. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Rabbi David Saperstein is Director Emeritus of the Religion Action Center of Reform Judaism. He served as its director and counsel for 40 years. Designated by Newsweek magazine as, quote, the most influential rabbi in America, and by the Washington Post as, quote, the quintessential religious lobbyist on Capitol Hill, Rabbi Saperstein has long been recognized as a leading voice in the community. As author J.J. Goldberg wrote, under his leadership, the Religion Action Center, quote, became one of the most powerful Jewish bodies in Washington. Rabbi Saperstein was the first rabbi in American history to be designated a U.S. ambassador when he served as the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom during the second term of the Obama administration. In this capacity, he served as a principal advisor to Secretary Kerry and President Obama on issues of international religious freedom and traveled widely as America's advocate for religious freedom and for the security of religious minorities across the globe. From 2019 to 2020, Rabbi Saperstein served as the president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, the international arm of the Reform Jewish movement. He remains today the senior advisor to the Union of Reform Judaism. And with that, I now welcome Rabbi Saperstein to join us. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really honored to be part of another Haberman Institute program here. The Habermans played a very important part and role in my life. They were dear friends, and I was often at Washington Hebrew. And we, both in Israel and here, our lives crossed over many decades together. So this is very sweet for me to have the opportunity to do this at a time that feels like a true crossroads for America, for Israel diaspora relations, for so many nations across the globe, for our organizations and institutions. Add to that, feels like a crossroads in terms of whether or not the resurgence of anti-Semitism across the globe and in our own nation is an aberration that will fade over time or reflects a new norm in American Jewish life and global Jewish life. My parents were, my father, beloved congregational rabbi for 50 years on Long Island. and my mother deeply involved in civic affairs. They were inveterate world travelers, somehow making it to 80 countries, mostly before jet airplanes. Everywhere they visited Jewish communities, and not surprisingly, they were active in the reform movement's international denomination that was alluded to in the introduction of World Union for Progressive Judaism. 50 years later, I was honored to serve as president of. But my first interaction, and most unforgettable for me, was my very first World Union Conference in 1959. Now, just know I spoke last week at the 100th anniversary convention in Israel with attendees from 40 countries. But in 59, try to picture this, I was 11, my older brother was 14, Mark. He would later become an award-winning Jewish historian. It was just the 34th anniversary convention of the World Union. It was held in London. In 59, the legendary Lily Montagu, a revered World Union for Progressive Judaism founder in 1925, was still in the chair, serving as president. Rabbi Leo Beck, the intellectual leader of the international movement, had died a few months earlier. And Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, deeply committed to liberal Judaism, was in attendance. And Mark and I scored an interview with him for our school newspaper. He couldn't have been nicer. And when Mark asked Mr. Frank, as a personal witness of one of the greatest tragedies of modern history, what his message would be to the youth of America, after warning about the persistence of anti-Semitism, Otto Frank answered, "I witnessed the power of a criminal dictatorial system and its consequences. The great dangers are mass movements, slogans, materialism, and egotism. I believe in the freedom of the human spirit. America must educate young people with strong character and with moral courage, who understand the needs of others and the true values of life." Meeting Otto Frank helped us understand what shaped the radiant spirit of a girl who at 13 could produce what is perhaps the most enduring literary legacy of that era. And sadly, his words and Anne's words, what is done cannot be undone, but one can prevent it happening again. Or how wonderful it is that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world. These words of father and daughter speak across these 7 decades to the challenges we face in our own nation today in 2025. America has been an extraordinary country for the Jewish community. In a nation founded in part by refugees who had fled religious persecution, religious freedom was essential to the founding of America. The free exercise and no establishment clauses enshrined in our Bill of Rights, taken together with Article 6 of the Constitution, which bans any religious tests for office, form the legal bedrock of our religious freedom regime. For the first time in human history, we created, in theory, a nation in which one's rights as a citizen would not depend upon their religious beliefs, their religious identity, or their religious peaceful practices. Revolutionary idea. And over these past 250 years, we have built a system that protects the rights of religious believers and non-believers alike to worship, practice, share, change, express their beliefs freely. Religious freedom has always been at the center of American values and our success as a nation, just as it is a vital component of our foreign policy today. Like many of our rights, it actually took us, that were promised in the founding document, it took us a long while to fulfill their promise. State establishments of religion didn't phase out entirely until the 1830s. Waves of xenophobic ideologies from the Know-Nothing parties in the mid-1800s to the two expansive flows of the KKK to the 20th century rise of neo-Nazi groups and militias, the rise of Christian nationalism in the late 20th century, all fueled supremacist ideas about America and fueled directly or indirectly anti-Semitism. We've been battling such influences in America since Jews protested Peter Stuyvesant's barring them from serving in the community guard when they arrived in 1654. But by the mid 20th century, something extraordinary had happened to a nation that had already given the Jewish community an enormous amount of rights. Almost always, since the mid 20th century, the advances were made with the Supreme Court behind us as the guarantor of the fundamental rights structure of our legal system. But now we may well have lost the court. So too for the Establishment Clause. The religious right has foisted a myth on America that somehow it seems like the court has indirectly adopted that somehow separation of state is anti-God or anti-religion. Nothing could be further from the truth. It is precisely that wall separating church and state that has kept government out of religion, allowing religion to flourish with a diversity and strength far surpassing that of any other democracy in the world, matched only by India, including all those that have state-funded, state-preferred, or state-established religions. Here, through the confluence of those three constitutional prongs that I talked about, here, we knew something different than we had known in our history. It was enhanced by that court here that gave the rights of minorities and women, Jews, Catholics, ethnic groups, blacks, LGBTQ, against the whims of the white majority in the privileged position of males. The result is a nation that has given Jews more rights, more freedoms, more opportunities, and allowed more achievements than we have ever known in 2,500 years of diaspora Jewish life, where during the last 100 years, Jews have moved from the peripheries of American society to the very center of American economic, cultural, political, educational life. We're disproportionately represented among the highest academic levels and highest income levels in fields like law and medicine and sciences and a range of culture and the arts for a number of years over the last 30 years. Well, let's say since 2015, the Jewish community, comprising 2% of the American population, had a minion in the United States Senate, 10% of the 100 senators, albeit a reform Jewish minion, but a minion nevertheless. Truly, this has been the golden age of American Jewry, one of the greatest eras of Jewish life that we have ever known, measured not just by our ability to participate in the highest levels of American society, but by the contributions of Jews within Jewish life. More courses on Judaism and Jewish topics in universities, more Jewish music being written, more Jewish chants created, more Jewish books, magazines, newspapers published, more sold in part since non-Jews eat up Jewish culture as well, more movies and TV shows featuring Jews and Jewish themes, more synagogues, more JCCs, more Jewish camps, more Jewish food produced and consumed, again, because general society eats up Jewish culture more than ever before, and in any other diaspora community. Indeed, in some of those categories, even more than in Israel, with its equal number of Jews. Today, so many of what we have achieved in this country feels like it is under attack. And if we fail to protect those rights, our children will know a very different America than was our experience, those of us who grew up in the 20th century. I should point out as well, in the 20th century, the United States promulgated a radically new vision of the implications of fundamental rights, including what religious freedom meant, that it gave to the world. In the mid-20th century, the two key international documents enshrining human rights drew from the vision of America's ideas and set them forth as fundamental human rights on a global level: the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. Today, as I am confident is the case with everyone on this call, I am most urgently concerned about the state of democracy and human rights. It is true here in the United States. Sadly, it is also true in Israel, and it is true from around the globe, as I heard from so many of those who attended the conference that I was just at in Israel just a week ago. Freedom House, one of the several authoritative evaluators of the global state of democracy and human rights, tells us that from 1945 until 2006, the midpoint of the ebb and flow globally moved consistently towards greater expansion of democracy and human rights. The United States, Canada, and Europe played a major role in that spread. Since 2006, there have been 19 consecutive years of declining rates of democracy and human rights. During 2024's unprecedented year of elections, there were 80 national elections last year, a record number of contests held. Many were marred by violence and authoritarian efforts to restrict voters' choices, often jailing opponents or barring parties from participating who could be rivals. In over 40% of the countries and territories that held national elections, candidates were targeted with assassination attempts or assaults. Polling places were attacked. Post-election protests were suppressed with disproportionate force. Elections in authoritarian countries were regularly manipulated to prevent genuine opposition candidates from participating. Here, of the civil liberties tracked by Freedom House's annual Freedom in the World report, freedom of expression has declined the most over the last 19 years. The number of countries and territories where the indicator for freedom of the media scored 0 out of 4, meaning there is virtually no space for independent media to operate, has almost tripled between 2006 and 2024, rising from 13 countries to 34 countries. And last year, attacks on the media in the form of censorship, arrests, imprisonments of journalists, physical, legal harassment, or violence recorded in over 120 countries and territories, including Gaza. And Amnesty International warned in its annual report, the State of the World's Human Rights Report, that the Trump administration anti-rights campaign sharply pared down the Human Rights Division of the State Department and is turbocharging harmful trends across the globe, gutting international human rights protections, endangering billions across the planet. This Trump effect, says Amnesty, has compounded the damage done by other world leaders throughout 24, eating away at decades of painstaking work to build up and advance universal human rights for all, accelerating humanity's plunge into a brutal new era characterized by intermingling authoritarian practices and corporate greed. Amnesty documents widespread, often vicious clampdowns on dissent, catastrophic escalations of armed conflict, during which all civil rights and human rights suffer, inadequate efforts to address climate collapse, and creating significant escalation of migrant populations, and a growing backlash globally against the rights of migrants, refugees, women, girls, LGBTQ people. Each of these faces further deterioration unless there is a global turnaround. President Trump seems to show contempt for universal human rights and the institutions aimed at protecting them. His government swiftly targeted vital U.S. and international institutions and initiatives that were designed to make ours a safer, fairer world, from our international communications institutions, Voice of America, et cetera, to USAID. His all-out assault on the very concepts of multilateralism, asylum, racial and gender justice, global health, and life-saving principles and institutions have already sustained and is further emboldening other anti-rights leaders and movements to join the onslaught. We're witnessing a creeping spread of authoritarian and oligarchical practices among nations across the globe, and governments across the world have sought to evade accountability, entrenching their power and instilling fear by banning media outlets, disbanding or suspending NGOs and political parties, imprisoning critics on baseless charges of terrorism or extremism, and by criminalizing human rights defenders, climate activists, and Palestinian solidarity protests, anti-Russian solidarity protests, and other dissenters. And of course, neither Israel nor the US has been spared. Indeed, compared to most of the democracies that have retrenched their rule of law and human rights, the US ranks with Hungary as having drifted the furthest in the shortest period of time. Here last week, the parasha was Noah, and of course, there is a famous debate over the opening words of the parasha that Noah was a righteous person in his generation, where the rabbis argue, what does that mean? That this was an evil generation, and compared to most of the others, he was more righteous? Or does it mean that he was a righteous person living up to the highest standards of what God asked of him and able to sustain it, even in an evil generation as he lived in? Here, it is a question that haunts us today. Is it enough for us to say that Israel does better than any of the surrounding country, even if it doesn't live up to the values in its Declaration of Independence, that America doesn't live up to our goals of equality and justice and fairness for all, but just we do better than other countries? That question is exactly the question that faces many of the countries in Europe and Israel and the United States and elsewhere across the globe. We have seen the consolidation of the press in Israel and the US, primarily by people and entities with ties to the controlling party and leader. President Trump has targeted the press, barring the press from covering him at the White House or State Department when they report on negative actions of his administration. He has attacked the mean, demonized the press, suing them repeatedly, forcing settlements, as he's done with universities, in which he has aimed at constraining their traditional freedoms. In Israel, of course, the military censorship kept stories and photos and videos of what was happening in Gaza from being seen there, even as the result of their being seen everywhere else globally. Israel is seen more and more widely as a pariah state and has no idea what it is people are responding to when they talk about what they saw on their screens as the suffering in Gaza. Under Israel's state of emergency, steps have been taken that violate basic rights, particularly freedom of expression and freedom of the press. Israel barred the press altogether from Gaza, attacked journalists who were functioning there, censored much of the descriptions from being heard in their country. There were also threats against judges in both countries. President Trump has ignored some court rulings. Just as in Israel, government ministers and Knesset members from the more right-wing parties have called for not complying with the high court's orders. Trump has demonized the courts, targeted individual judges with his vitriol when they reached decisions he opposed, even as he has transformed the formerly independent Justice Department trial division into a tool to wreak political vengeance against his perceived enemies, firing those who investigated him, pushing publicly for their indictments, and then firing regional U.S. attorneys who decide that an indictment was not warranted or justified. Israel Democracy Institute describes that efforts to weaken the gatekeepers, the ones who are built into the government structure to monitor problems of human rights abuses and civil rights abuses, that this was advanced by the dismissal of the Attorney General and the head of Shin Bet, utilizing new firing and hiring mechanisms unshackled by the legal safeguards that have been formulated over decades to ensure the independence of these gatekeepers and to preserve proper governance. Alongside these actions were actions to take over other gatekeeping institutions, such as the Civil Service Commissioner, This mimics the steps taken by President Trump, who began his term by firing many of the independent inspector general positions created by Congress in every department in the executive branch. A number of them have been filed, as well as for many individual important programs that have their own inspector generals within those departments to investigate without political interference or control any corruption or violation of law, wrongdoing, or government activities. That structure of those independent positions now have been gravely weakened by the president's actions. He exercised his approval of the vocal support from Israeli ministers and coalition Knesset members, President Trump did, who called for the cancellation of the prime minister's criminal trial. Effort from the religious right in Israel to curtail equal rights for women, LGBTQ, and non-Orthodox Judaism, three areas that we kind of always lifted up as showing how Israel was different from many of the countries in that region and from many other non-democratic countries in the world. Those attacks have grown in intensity and scope, even as President Trump was challenging all DEI programs and seeking to reverse some of the most precious achievements of the American civil rights movement, in which the Jewish community and Jewish lawyers played such a vital role. Within the Knesset and its committees, bills that harm the rule of law and basic rights have been advanced. Here, President Trump has, of course, tried to extort compliance to his ideological and policy agenda from law firms and universities by threatening their access to government money and government functions. He threatens Democratic mayors by sending troops into their cities. He threatens members of his own party who would challenge his actions by pledging to pour his prestige and electoral coffers into defeating them with his own candidates in the next primary election. The range of these efforts to crack down are enormous. And the question is, how can they best be resisted? And there are four major areas. This is true in Israel, and it's true in the United States. I'm going to focus on the United States. First, fighting these in the courts. Overwhelmingly, when these cases have been tested and these actions have been tested in the courts have struck down the vast majority of the steps that he has taken. And they have moved up towards the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has not yet reached a decision on many of them substantively. They've allowed a disproportionate number to move ahead here with very few exceptions while they're being tested through the court system. Here, which is for many an alarming development. But we don't know in the end where that court will decide. But in the meantime, the administration has obeyed a number of the lower court rulings, but it has ignored some of them when it has been most convenient for them to do so. I will say that I'm particularly proud of the Israel Religious Action Center, modeled after the center I ran for the reform movement here, that really is one of the great advocates in court for religious freedom rights, the rights of immigrants who come to Israel, and stands up to have the Israeli courts really enforce the laws against racist incitement in Israel. Nobody is doing more litigation on those. So again, in both countries, the courts will be a significant help in blocking the excesses of the efforts to unravel the democratic structures of these countries. Second is states and municipalities. Here, if you can't get things done in a deadlock Congress here, and a Congress that is not friendly to some of the democratic norms that are being damaged, here, there's a lot that can be done in the states and in municipalities, not just in the blue states, but in the purple states as well. A number of right after the Roe v. Wade was struck down, significant victories protecting women's rights and reproductive rights took place in not just blue states, but in other states as well. I'm very proud of the fact that my successor at the Religious Action Center, Jonah Pestner, has really built up our movement's infrastructure. And in doing so, we are working with friendly reform, conservative and Orthodox synagogues in localities and states around the country in ways that have greatly expanded the cooperation at those levels. The third is protests and mobilizing civil society. Keep in mind the power of civil society. Take Israel for a moment here. The protests in Israel against the judicial coup, as well as the hostage protests, were, as a percentage of the population, quite likely the largest continuing peaceful protests in world history. In the first term of the Trump administration, he faced such mobilization for the Women's Rights March, the Black Lives Matter protests, the protests against the ban on Muslim immigrants. But he learned, and rather than taking one step at a time, in the second term, he has flooded the nation with unpopular policies and actions that undermine democracy. And the result has been to somewhat paralyze civil society. The No Kings rallies are welcome exceptions, but they are dwarfed by what happened in the first term. Here, it will be interesting to see, is there something that will trigger massive protests and resistance across the country? We know from the polls how unpopular are the anti-democratic steps that he has taken in the main. Here it is not translated into kind of organized outrage on the streets here, and which leaves us with the fourth form of resistance, which is, of course, elections. Here I'm talking carefully here. I'm and speaking as an individual for the next 2 minutes. Here, there's just no way to avoid this. But none of the 501c3 organizations that I'm associated with in any capacity take positions in partisan terms. But mobilizing all legitimate ways to shape the outcome of election is vital for even the nonprofits. That is, mobilizing people to get registered, encouraging them to go to the polls, helping them get to the polls here. But in America, if those prepared to fight the move towards autocracy, be they Republicans willing to break with President Trump's policies or Democrats, if there is not a majority of those two that take back the one of the houses in the next election, I dreadfully fear that we will face the worst 2 years in America that we have faced since the end of the Civil War. I think that this president will see even a narrow victory as a mandate to just do whatever he wants to do, and recognizing it takes 2 years to get up in the to make its way through the court system, and that in the meantime the High Court is likely to let him continue. I think there'll be almost no checks and balances holding him in check. In Israel, if as a result of the next elections, we have a repeat of this particular right-wing coalitional configuration, the polls indicate that's not likely to happen here, but Bibi Netanyahu has made a remarkable economy rebound in terms of the support he has in polls here. If those who stand firmly committed to a democratic Jewish state will be facing, if we have a repeat of this government, far more forceful efforts to annex the West Bank, thereby intensifying global opposition to Israel, leaving it more of a pariah state. Thinking of President Trump a few days ago, threatening to cut off American support if annexation goes through. Can you imagine if Joe Biden, who I think probably believed that, but if he had actually said that, what the reaction would have been from the right wing in the or the conservative end of the Jewish community here? and doing so will eviscerate the prospects for a just resolution to the conflict of a two-state solution. Judicial independence, the equal rights of women, as well as the achievements in the LGBTQ rights, and the continued government support for non-Orthodox institutions, where we had made significant gains in the last 30 years, all will be under more pressure than ever before and may be lost. In every country affected by movement away from democracy, only sustained and coordinated action can reverse the nearly 2 decades of decline in global freedom and ensure that more countries continue to enjoy security, prosperity, and all the benefits of the freedom of them and freedoms of democratic rule. When Franklin Foer wrote in his seminal Atlantic piece, The End of the Golden Age of American Jewry, going over much of the territory I have here today about what helped make that period of the last 75 years so great for American Jewry, in the end, he describes how many Jews are giving up on America, are seeking citizenship in other countries. Sadly, I would note, few aiming towards Israel. It was, I believe with all my heart, the wrong way to end his piece. And I end my talk by simply saying we have not lost our democratic structures yet and our institutions. We can restore them in a way that will maintain that golden age. And that ought to be the goal of anyone in the Jewish community who cares about the future of American Jewry here. Unless you be disheartened, I should point out that those 80 elections that were held this year actually held a surprising number that actually turned out better than expected, with shifts towards more democratic-minded governments in countries like Poland and Sri Lanka and Zambia and Thailand and Bangladesh and Bhutan and Senegal, non-election shifts towards democracy in Brazil with the conviction of Bolsonaro, and Syria with the overthrow of such a despotic regime. Here, look, on all of these issues, decisions are going to be made. And one of the most effective antidotes to this hate, violence, and injustice is the power and effectiveness of coalitions of decency. There was not a single achievement that we obtained in America in the 20th century that did not happen because of a bipartisan coalition of decency on Capitol Hill and multi-partisan and bipartisan or nonpartisan, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religions coalitions of decency in every community across America. We live at a time where there is more interfaith and multi-faith dialogue, networking, and cooperative endeavor, more civil society empowerment in fighting for religious tolerance and freedom, peacemaking, reconciliation efforts, and in providing social services, education, medical care, food, and shelter, particularly in developing countries. But as we see with the ending of SNAP and what will be the loss of health insurance for many Americans, it's going to be the religious communities and the coalitions and civil society coalitions that are going to step in while we're fighting the battle to get government to take its place in providing these core efforts that were part of the basically liberal vision of America that dominated from 1940 on in America. And of course, in the very act of meeting and sharing and dialoguing and working together across divides and enhancing that kind of cooperation, we're modeling the kind of world that we dream of and which we strive to create. There are crucial decisions that are going to be made. And in an age where it seems technology allows us to do virtually anything, what we should do, the moral question is a question that faces humanity. On that, the religious communities have an extraordinary contribution to make. And as daunting as the challenges are, we live at a time of hope, of which our ancestors, our prophets, our sages throughout the ages could only have dreamed. We may indeed face perilous and unprecedented problems, but paradoxically, we may well be the first generation living in a world capable of creating the kind of just, peaceful, compassionate society our prophets, our religious values, our history charges us to build. For we are the first generation that actually produces enough food to feed every human being on earth. A failure to do it now is a failure of moral vision and political will. We're the first generation that can conquer malaria and an array of diseases that have plagued humanity from time immemorial. The failure to do so is a failure of moral vision and political will. We're the first generation that can educate every child, including every girl on earth, lift every person out of poverty, undo damage to our environment before it is too late, can spread freedom and democracy across the globe. For all of these, our failure to do so is a failure of moral vision and political will. On all these issues, the one thing I've learned so clearly in my 50 years of religious and moral advocacy to government and society is that someone will decide. Our only choice is whether we will be the audience watching others make those decisions, or if we will be the authors of those decisions. We in the Jewish community have disproportionately utilized our legitimate democratic rights to help shape the country that produced the golden age of American Jewry. If we remain silent now or quiescent now, in the vacuum of our silence will come voices that do not share our values, our dreams, our aspirations. As Dr. King said in his remarkable Riverside speech on Vietnam, we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residues of numerous civilizations are written the most pathetic of all epitaphs, the words, too late. For God's sake, for the sake of our children and our children's children, for America's sake, for Israel's sake, we must not be too late. So this above all, in this bleak and challenging period, we're not the prisoners of the mistakes of a bitter and unremitting past. Working together, we can be, we must be, and we will be the shapers of a better and more hopeful future. The Jewish people's destiny depends on it. Israel depends on it. America, as a beacon of hope to the world, depends on it. And I hope that God finds us worthy of that call.
Thank you, Rabbi Saperstein, for such an engaging talk filled with your wisdom from many years. For those of you with questions, feel free to ask them now. Questions on any subject and scope, we'll hope to address as many as possible.
Matt, before you begin, while you're processing the questions there, let me say one word more. And I debated whether to say this at the very beginning or at the end here. This is a tough talk to give. I'm sure it was a tough talk to hear, although I'm sure nothing I said was unknown to a single person here. The question is context. There are times where I could give a speech, and I often do when I'm dealing with progressive groups, about what is right about Israel, the extraordinary achievements of Israel, the extraordinary rights and opportunities that it provides for the people from all these nations across the globe, mostly Jewish, but non-Jews as well, who have sought safety and security there. There's much I can say about what makes America still the beacon of hope in the world. And of all the extraordinary things that have happened, with all the limitations, with all the structural injustice that exists in America, the truth is, of our 330 million people, 40 million people now, there are a good 250 million women and people of minority groups in this country, people of color and other minorities in this group that enjoy rights and freedoms and opportunities that their great-grandparents could have only dreamed of in their most wonderfully wild imaginations about it. We must not forget, and with everything that we've done, and I understand that the cutting off of so much of aid and that has happened here endangers what I'm about to say, But America over these last decades has been such a bastion of help for fighting disease, in educating people, in providing aid and food to the hungry across the globe, and supporting international efforts to help those. Though there are more migrants and displaced people in the world today than ever before in human history. And America has, above all, been the force to do it. I could give an entirely different talk and not and passingly just mention some of the negative things that are going on. But the negative things now have become to me so dangerous and perilous that it threatens everything that has made Israel and America great. And those who love those two countries have a particular responsibility to do everything they can, from whatever political context they have, to ensure that what makes Israel that uniquely democratic Jew and Jewish state maintains itself, and what makes America the democratic model to the world is regained here and restored because of our work. And I just wanted to say, I didn't know whether to begin by saying that, but I thought I would say it be at the end before we began the questions here.
Yes, thank you very much. And we can jump into questions. We have a number that have come in, and as I said, feel free to ask more. The first question here is, how do you understand and navigate the current administration's division of American Jews as, quote, good Jews and bad Jews?
The president seems to have an inclination to divide the world into good and bad, depending on whether they agree with him or are critical of him. Here, he, in talking about the election, when the election came, he said, if I lose, it's going to be the Jews' fault, and he referenced the Jews who opposed him as being having again a disproportionate impact here. It is a tendency that we all have. One of the problems in this hyper-partisanized country of ours is that we think that about the other. Here, liberals think that anyone who supports President Trump, who's MAGA, is just bad. They really don't want to keep the America we have here. And they're bad people who are comfortable with bad policy that will leave out those who are different and minority groups. And people on the right think liberals want to take away everything that made America great and gave them and their parents and grandparents and great grandparents all the opportunities they have. Donald Trump managed to capture the hearts and minds of millions of people, millions of workers in this country, mostly blue-collar workers, who were left out and left behind by globalization and by tight technological changes that saw industries in America shut down. And they didn't believe for a minute that they could be retrained into a new job in the tech world that would give them the salaries and benefits that they over generations had fought for in the manufacturing industries of America. And they were convinced, and they're right, according to the experts, that their children would be the first children in 4 generations in America who would be less well off than they were. In every generation before, it had been, my kids will be better off than we did. And all the things that we depended on here are just not holding true. All the things we depended on over the last century are not holding true. If you got a good education, you'd be guaranteed a good job. No longer true. If you had a good job and you are a loyal worker, you have a job for life. Here, if you were able to save your money, you could go to the suburbs and buy a house, and that house would always increase in value here. And your kids, in the end, would be better off. All of these have been undermined by the radical changes that have happened in the economy, the global economy, the growing gap between the rich and the poor in this country, the weakening of the middle class in all the developed countries, including the United States and Israel. Here, the tech industry in Israel has boomed during the war here, but almost the rest of its economy really is suffering. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing larger in those two countries. Here, so he's captured something, that we don't get, and we think the other data just don't get it. If only they could see things as clearly as I do, they'd be on the good guy side. Instead, they're on the bad guy side. Each side thinks it about themselves here. And yes, so they're going to think it about Jews as much as about others. But of course, then you have the really extreme elements, the ones that are advocating the myths of Jews who, with the great replacement theory, that Jews are behind bringing in blacks and Latinos and ethnic groups that will undercut the whites in America, and they were the ones. What was Tucker Carlson's latest thing, that Jews were behind designing the virus, the COVID virus, in a way that would protect Ashkenazic Jews here, and he's palling with Nick Fuentes here. Those kinds of things, we would hope people of all political stripes would stand together to say that that's wrong. But it's hard to work across partisan lines. It's hard to work across ethnic lines or racial lines or religious lines when you feel that your longtime partners let you down, or they feel you've let them down. How can the Jewish community, who is at the bastion and the forefront of so many struggles for justice, be silent with all the suffering, who's ever causing it, all the suffering that's happening in Gaza? Here, everyone is disappointed in the other, and we've got to have the courage to model something different if we're going to make it.
Thank you. On that note, someone asked if you're concerned about the intra-Jewish positions on the morality of Israel's war policies in Gaza, if you want to say more about that.
For those of us who have been outspoken about the suffering in Gaza, again, Hamas bears an enormous responsibility for this. If it hadn't triggered the war, that suffering wouldn't have been happening. If it hadn't been oppressing its people, if it hadn't been using them as human shields, if it hasn't integrated its entire military infrastructure into the civilian infrastructure, Israel, here, many in the Jewish community felt, could have fought a war in a way that would substantially have minimized that. It should not have used the shutting off of food and medicine and other essentials of life here, that it was a just war as a just cause for the war. Here it was not fought in a way that really lived up to Israel's standard and to international standards. When you saw some of the videos that Israeli soldiers were posting, bragging about things they had done, it was just heartbreaking about it. In Israel, nobody saw any of that here. It's hard to be critical of Israelis for not having done more here. What mobilized them was the hostage situation as a call for the end of the war. Here in America, there was a sharp divide generationally, a sharp divide between those Jews who really could not justify the sanctioning of the kind of suffering that we were seeing, and was urging Israel to fight the war differently than it was here. So we're going to be left with scars generationally between everyone, I'm sure, who's on this webinar, as someone in their family of the younger generation who just has given up on Israel because of the way it saw Israel behave. Here, I was hearing from people around the world of synagogues where people broke away because the synagogue was too liberal on or critical of Israel, or was not critical enough on Israel and broke away and formed a new congregation that was a break-off congregation because of that. Those kind of divisions are going to haunt us, and I don't know how you heal them. If there are kids in our younger generation who feel whatever Zionism was intended to be, they don't have a right, they don't have a problem with the right of the Jewish people to recognize that not just a religion, they've been a people for 3,000 years, to have the right to a national aspirations and to fulfill their national aspirations. But the way that Zionism has played out with the occupation after 75 years, for however many years, since 60, 58 years or whatever it is, has led to a structure in which an entire people, several million people, just don't have the rights that everyone else in Israel has. And it's become, and the way was true with blacks in America here, that Israeli Arabs don't have the rights that Israeli Jews have. They have them in theory, but they're not able to actualize them, and they face discrimination that Jews don't face in Israel. Here they look at this and they say, don't tell me I have to be a Zionism. Don't tell me Israel has to be central to my religion. How do we close that gap? I think it requires enormous courage to accept that. It isn't, if we think what Israel's thought for 75 years, this is all a Hasbara problem. If everyone knew the truth, there would have no problem with Israeli policy here. But there are people who just believe the occupation is inherently wrong and evil here. Whatever the justification might have been to do it temporarily, it is long past gone. How do you bridge those gaps in the Jewish community? Here, the gaps between the settlers willing to use violence against civilians to drive them out of the West Bank here, and the rabbis for human rights who are standing up for the Palestinians and putting their bodies on the line to defend their. How does Israel bridge those gaps? How does American Jewry? It will require love and humility and an open heart and listening and finding a willingness to actually work together as Jews on what we can agree with, even if we disagree on fundamental propositions that are painful to live in disagreement with. Here, if we're going to survive as one people, as Am Yisrael Echad, as a single people of Israel, here, it is going to require a lot of difficult steps. I've made a number of recommendations in my speeches to congregations about actually how to open up the doors to people who are questioning Zionism and challenging Zionism, who are challenging Jewish supremacy, what they see as Jewish supremacy in Israel, who are harshly challenging the IDF's, the way the method of fighting the war, or whoever was setting the strategy for the war. I think there's a lot of work we have to do to be open to listen both directions on this. It's going to haunt us for a couple of generations. It will haunt us forever if the hot fighting resumes and it continues and Gaza truly is destroyed in a way that drives the people out and they're ethnically cleansed from Gaza and ethnically cleansed from the West Bank. I don't know how the Jewish people comes together after that happens. It's one of the reasons I'm so strong about we've got to get the democratic norms back. The press has to be free to report on what's happening in a way they're not now in Israel, in Gaza, on the West Bank, here. And there has to be open debate that not just within Israel, but amongst world Jewry as well. Just add one other note. For all those people critical of Israel, it is also true that Israel remains surrounded by forces greatly weakened by the success of Israel's military strategy outside of Gaza here, but still surrounded by forces that if they believe they can militarily destroy Israel, would not hesitate to do so. Israel knocked out a lot of the missile launchers of Hezbollah. Hezbollah still has tens of thousands of missiles that are larger, more accurate, more deadly than the ones Hamas has been firing at Israel. Here, these are forces committed to Israel's destruction. They haven't changed, and only Israel's strength, enhanced by American support, stands in the way of that happening. That's the cognitive dissonance that we have to deal with. And we have to keep all of these realities in mind, and be respectful of those who emphasize one over the other, if we're going to hold together as a community.
Thank you. There's a comment slash question here, more about the um, politics involved. Here we have somebody say President Trump has set up the Abraham Accords and moved forward on Gaza-Israeli negotiations, while Obama and Biden did absolutely nothing to support Israel. What are your thoughts on the differences in policies?
Okay, so look, what President Trump did in moving the embassy symbolically to Jerusalem, in bringing about the Abraham Accords, in bringing about the end to the ceasefire. These are extraordinary things. And with all of my criticism of this, the reform movement, like every other Jewish unstintingly praised the president. It wasn't, well, this was really great, but here, it needs to be acknowledged in its own right. I think there's concern that the president, who can easily be distracted from one thing to another or change his mind, needs to have the consistency to hold all the parties accountable, to the commitments that they've made. Here it remains to be seen what will happen on that, but he has to be praised. I just live in a different world than the people who made those comments about Biden, and Obama. Obama gave more aid to Israel, unprecedented amounts of aid, more weapons to Israel, had as good a cooperation in terms of intelligence sharing, and I saw this inside the State Department, here, as any president had ever given Israel. Biden exceeded all of that. He's a guy who stood up in the middle of this war when everyone was coming down to Israel and said, "I am a Zionist here, and I'm proud to be a Zionist." What president said anything like that, including Trump, here in the entire history of Israel's existence? Here, and Biden, even when he was critical of things that Israel was doing in terms of how it was fighting the war, he did not cut off weapons to Israel, etc. President Trump said he would cut off all American aid if they annex the West Bank. Here, I think a lot of the liberals in the Jewish community actually would approve of that. Here, but the notion that any of those presidents didn't have the tension between admiring, caring deeply about Israel, for Israel, wanting to stand as a champion for Israel, but really believing that Israel was doing things that were counter to its own interests and counter to America's interests, here, and counter to the well-being of the region, here, is also true. And here, President Trump has some of those same dilemmas. Here, I hope Israel listens to him, because of what he has done for them. Here, but the notion that there's a difference between Obama or Biden or Trump in terms of the staunch support to Israel, unprecedented military, and it was Biden who first deployed American forces to fight in the region, to do it. No president had done that before. I don't think there's any difference between the three of them, as one being more pro-Israel than the other. But President Trump absolutely deserves the praise that he has received for the Abraham Accords, and for bringing a ceasefire and the release of the hostages to effect.
Thank you. There's several questions on, not on the scale of the president, but other political leaders and sort of the rise of anti-Semitism among liberal leaders. If want to speak broadly about that in our world today, it's on the top of many people's minds.
Well, there is anti-Semitism on the right that is well documented. We see it all across the globe. We see it with great alarm, the rise of far right-wing parties in European countries where we never thought after World War II we would see voices like that now playing a role in governments, sometimes a large role in governments. It is a serious concern for us here. Much of the violence that has been wrought against Jews in the United States here has come from the right, not from the left. For years, we had guards at our synagogues, not because of anti-Semitism from the left, but because of Tree of Life and Poway and attacks on Jewish institutions going back 30 years, almost always coming or spurred from the right, and some from forces neither right or left. Here, if ethnic groups beat up Jews on the street of an urban city, is it right, left? It isn't because of Palestinians. It's not because of Jews' control of the world. Here, it just has to do with integrated group hatreds that happens for all kinds of irrational reasons and plagues every society here. Here, and I don't know necessarily that just because people attacked on the streets because of Israel from Palestinians, that's necessarily coming from the left. It often comes from fundamentalist pro-Palestinian forces, Islamic forces that are not left politically, not left religiously, here by any shade, and it's not a fair depiction to talk about that all as from the left. It comes from many sources, and we have to combat them all, and we have to do it together here. And those of us who live in the progressive world have a particular responsibility to confront it in the progressive world. And I'm proud of the Religious Action Center and those of us in the Reform movement who very often are point persons in coalitions where people try to take over coalitions here to get them to say anti-Israel things, even when the coalition has nothing to do with that. It's an environmental coalition, reproductive rights coalition. It's a economic justice, a food program. And if we're not there, if we walk away from them because an anti-Israel group joins that coalition, we give them free rein to pressure the group to say anti-Israel stuff. If we're there fighting against it, here we become a strong force on behalf of the Jewish community and on behalf of Israel to prevent those groups from being manipulated into doing anti-Israel, anti-Jewish things. It is important for us to maintain our broad engagement in broad coalitions on the right and the left in America. And the people on the right have an obligation to stand up against the Christian nationalists who say this ought to be a Christian country here, and the kind of democratic norms that evolved from the First Amendment's free exercise and establishment clause are bad for America. Christians ought to have a special place in America here. And when people on the right are involved in anti-Semitic activities, which I said most of the violence comes from, it is people on the right in our community have an obligation to stand up and forcefully denounce them and forcefully call on their allies in conservative and right-wing coalitions to denounce them. them as well. So this is a tough period of time. As I said, it remains to be seen whether this is an aberration here or this is just a new reality that is going to reshape the democratic countries of the world here. If so, it is going to be a much more perilous existence for Jews, and the time to stop it from going in that direction, the time to move it back here is right now, not 5 years from now, not, well, let's see what happens. It is for every one of us to get involved to protect the democratic norms that alone can ensure Jewish safety, Jewish security, and the well-being of the rule of law and democratic norms maintaining themselves.
Thank you. There's someone here has written that wrote, I hear many people in my generation, just before boomers and even much younger, worried to the point that one, getting passports from other countries, or two, placing money in accounts in Canada. How worried are you? And this is a personal question, but maybe we can make it more broadly. What do you think about those precautions?
I think that people have to do what they feel they have to do. This feels like a perilous time for Jews. Although, again, the numbers of anti-Semitic incidents, which have escalated enormously, as a percentage of 340 million Americans, is infinitesimal. And unlike any other time in Jewish history, wherever these acts happen, anywhere in the world, now, as opposed to, let's say, the 1930s, where governments were often complicit in those things, now almost every government everywhere in the world condemns it, stands against it, provides protection for Jewish institutions here, as it has to do in some countries for Muslim institutions, as Islamophobia has risen as well. Here, this is a very different reality than the 1930s were for us. But there's no guarantee which direction it will go. So I understand if people want to get a passport to another country, want to put money and diversify where they put their put their money. I hope and pray that Israel will feel safer to people, so that one of the places other people thinking of leaving, even America, think about going to is Israel. But right now, Israel feels no safer, and in fact, a lot less safer than a number of the other countries that people are getting passports to. So I appreciate that. But in the end, none of that will guarantee security and safety if we lose the great experiment of democracy that has marked the last 250 years. Is this just a blip of 250 years in world history? And we're going to go back to the oligarchical, autocratic rules that were the norms of much of human history? Or is this an ebb and flow of we're feeling in terms of democracy? And we've really hit an ebb, but one day it's going to come back, it's going to reverse and come back forcefully. We can make that latter image become a reality, but it won't happen if we just wait for others to do it. So the best way to secure the well-being of Jews in America is to fight for a restoration of the America that President Trump and others are trying to dismantle here. If the MAGA world prevails in America, there's not going to be a place for Jews in a way that there has been for the last 75 years in America. Actually, I would argue for the last 250 years in America, with all the problems we had in earlier times here. So this is a battle for Jewish survival, as it is a battle for American freedom, democracy, rule of law, and our constitutional order.
Thank you. And so we have a few questions. You mentioned some strategies during your presentation. And so some people are asking again, like what strategies you have. One person is asking specifically that they've tried some of the strategies you mentioned, and if you have other suggestions. So if there's just anything else that you would like to offer these individuals asking about strategies for responding to the situation.
I think the community as a whole has to do a better job with helping those of us who are on the progressive side, what the lessons are that we've learned about what works and what doesn't work here, rather than just bemoaning that it looks like progressives are abandoning America. It is true that the polls show that people who are liberals or Democrats here are increasingly critical of Israel and increasingly sympathetic to the Palestinians. But I don't think that's an anti-Semitic thing. It will reverse when Israel relationship with the Palestinians changes here. And, in those times when Oslo was happening, the support for Israel was unprecedented in America here. So, these aren't structural changes that will last permanently. But in the meantime, we have to do a better job. Keep in mind here, when it comes to what we consider pro-Israel, people who vote for the aid package of Israel, to provide it the arms it needs to defend itself, overwhelmingly, here, the Democrats in Congress are with Israel in all of that. They may be more outspokenly critical of particular policies and particularly how the war was fought in Gaza here, but it doesn't stop them from supporting Israel here. And there are people on the right in the Senate and Congress who are, who are critical of Israel also and are calling for, isolationism in general and withdrawal from the support we have for Israel. Here, this is a fight we're going to have for a long period of time here, but I think people worried about what's happening on the left here. We need help from Israel changing its policies here, but we need to know what works and what doesn't work better in terms of reaching it. And the same with our kids who are feeling abandoned by us, who feel we have not lived up to the very values that we taught them. Those of us who remain supporters of Israel here, and they say, how can you still support Israel here when you watch what it's doing to the Palestinians on the West Bank in Gaza? We have to know what the better ways are to engage with them too. And a number of our congregations and our rabbis have really had outreach where they really give those people a place to be heard here. They tell them, make it clear to them that then they're not outsiders to the community, and slowly over time help them see the complexities of the cognitive dissonance that we talked about, of the two truths that are in tension with each other here, that Israel and Zionism as the national liberation existential character of what Judaism is about and what the Jewish people are about has a place that they can find comfort to be involved with as well. But if Israel's policies don't change, we're never going to get those kids back here. It doesn't mean Israel doesn't have to do what it has to do to be secure and defend itself. But in terms of a number of the policies that I've talked about, if we're going to win back the children who have felt utterly disenfranchised as Jews to have a place in the community because of their sharp criticism of how Israel fights the war and what the occupation is doing to Palestinians, here it will be a loss to the Jewish people that will take generations to repair.
Thank you. We have I guess it's more of a comment than a question, but from one of our participants in Hawaii mentions, does the fact that Hawaii has a Jewish governor, a Jewish mayor, and the Maui County, and a Jewish senator hold hope for the future? If you have any
I think
thoughts
so.
on.
We still have that minion in the United States Senate too. I mean, in the last six Congresses, four of them, the 2 year of which the length of each Congress by number. Here, four of the six has had a Jewish minion, and one of them is Brian Schatz, the senator, the Jewish senator from Hawaii. Um, Jews are represented, this is what I said before, Jews are represented all over the country, and we're not declining in numbers in terms of that. We still play an active role and disproportionate to our percentage of the population. Here in the picture of Hawaii is definitely there. And I think the best thing they can do, Matt, would be to send the two of us out to Hawaii to do a tour, a speaking tour in Hawaii together here. That would be the most helpful thing that people could do. Here,
Definitely.
here. No, but I mean, that little vignette is the America. It's why the golden age continues here in the way people live their lives day to day. Here with unprecedented opportunities, unprecedented privileges, unprecedented achievements, unprecedented rights, unprecedented, when, God forbid, an anti-Semitic incident, the whole community turns out. People help clean up desecrated tombstones. They help stand around each other's houses of worship, whether it's a Sikh temple that's been hit, or a mosque that's been hit, or Mother Emanuel Church. Here, the whole community turns out to stand with them here. That America still exists. Here, it is still the norm of America. You know the old line about journalism: a million planes land safely, and nobody writes a story about it. One crashes, and every paper in the world is writing a story about it. Here, the hate crimes and hate speech that permeates in our society has become prevalent enough that we're obsessed, rightfully, with it. But we have to keep perspective. This is still the most remarkable country on earth, outside Israel, for the Jewish people here, and we have to do everything to ensure that it remains that way.
Thank you. And on that note, we probably have received at least 5 questions asking about the election in New York. And so I don't, it's up to you whether or not you want to make any comment. A number of people are asking about your views on the topic, or what you would say to Mamdani if you were speaking to him. So if there's,
Well, let me comment on the rabbi's letter that went out, the 1,000 rabbis who wrote a letter raising concerns about Mandami, and the two videos, Rabbi Hirsch's video and Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove's video, that got so much national attention, international attention here. Here, I've never met Mamdani. I don't know him. Here, I can't speak from personal experience. Here, um, it is hard for me to think that a mayor of a city, even a city with a large Jewish population, matter of fact, because it's a large Jewish population, it's hard for me to think of anything that, whatever his views might be, he's going to actually do that will be inimical to Israel's interests. Here, he has gone out of his way to say, as I know Andrew Cuomo will, and Curtis Sliwa would, here, to protect the Jewish community, to ensure that they're safe, to ensure that their institutions are safe. I think he knows the world is watching on that. I take him at face value, but just in terms of his political future, I think it will depend on successfully doing that here. And I'm not particularly concerned, as much as I may disagree with things that he has said or views that he holds. I'm not concerned in reality it is going to make a difference. And in some ways, it may prove a point that I've been trying to make, that even people who are sharply critical of Israel's policies are not out there to create anti-Semitism, actually are against anti-Semitism. They can be key allies in fighting anti-Semitism. It doesn't mean that people should remain silent and condemn someone you want to be an ally or who is an ally on other things, here, even on anti-Semitism, when they say or do things that you think are wrong. And I think people had an absolute right to explain why they thought his positions about not denouncing the globalization of the Intifada, or not withdrawing his assertion that Israel's actions in Gaza violated the international treaty against genocide. Here, people have an absolute right to speak out, and that's fine. I regret a couple of things about the way those pieces were written. So it has nothing to do now with Mamdani. Here, what the letter said after it explained why it was concerned about Mamdani, when it came to kind of a central point, it worded in a very broad way. It said that when someone says things that are terrible about Israel, that you have to show your opposition, use the democratic process. This is in the context of a letter about Mamdani here, issued right before the election. Use the democratic process to show that you won't support people who do that. What that was implicitly leaving people reasonably with the thing is, as a general standard here, if somebody's really bad on Israel, Jews should vote for their opponent. And that has never been the position of 90% of the rabbis I think, who signed that letter. Here, we've never been a single issue community. And at a time that democracy hangs by a thread, not hangs by a thread, but it's facing a crossroads in which we may go in a direction that will destroy everything that has made America great for the Jews, to say that a MAGA candidate who is committed to all of the destructive elements of what President Trump has done about democracy, who's critical of Israel, harshly critical of Israel, who thinks that the Israel violated the genocide treaty by what it did in Gaza, that you should vote for the MAGA candidate rather than the candidate who's for democracy, for the rule of law, for immigrant rights, for women's rights, for against hate crimes of any kind. Here, it's just not good for the Jews. It's not a good position. I wish that letter had been crafted a little bit differently to clarify that's not what they were saying, because I think people reasonably can read it into it. I was a little disappointed that Elliot Cosgrove, who, for any of the people in the webinar who don't know him, is one of the great congregational rabbis of this generation, one of the smartest rabbis I know, one of the most eloquent rabbis I know. Here, he is an ally with me on so many things that we hold in common. I really was disappointed that he chose to do this, wearing his tallis on Shabbat in the middle of the services, although I think I want to acknowledge he didn't do it during the morning service or the Musaf service. He did it in between the two services. But standing on the pulpit in front of the ark, wearing his tallis here, this is exactly what we have since 1954, when the Johnson Amendment was passed, saying nonprofits cannot use any of their resources, directly or indirectly, for or against candidates in partisan elections. Talk about the issues if you want. If people draw the conclusions who you're voting for, that's one thing, but you can't actually be endorsing candidates from the pulpit. And the two groups that have violated that over the last decades have been the African American community, where their church was the only institution they had independence of for decades and decades and decades, and can speak their mind. I understand it, but I was sharply against it when I sat on the national board for 29 years of the NAACP, and for 5 years I chaired their national religious leaders conference. I made this argument over and over to them and urged them to urge their colleagues not to be endorsing or opposing candidates from the pulpit, to stick from the issues. If they wanted to do it in a individual, personal capacity outside the church, on their own, making it clear they're doing it individually. That rabbi's letter, by the way, was very clear. We are all doing this individually. as individuals here. And I commend the letter for having included that. I thought Elliot made a misjudgment doing that. The other thing he did that puzzled me was a week or two earlier at a meeting at Beth Elohim, I think it was a Reformed congregation in Brooklyn. Mamdani had responded to obviously questions that would he have a litmus test about Israel as Zionism and who he brought into his administration. He said, I want to make it clear, no litmus test. Anyone, whatever their view on Zionism, is welcome in my administration. And I'm not just talking about liberal Zionists. I'm talking about any Zionists. They will, if they're qualified, they have a place in my position. Elliot was actually critical of it, saying that the way he talked about it kind of legitimized litmus tests. I just don't buy that. I think he did exactly what we want progressive leaders to do. If every progressive leader I'm involved with in progressive coalitions and political coalitions and allyships, they were saying the same thing. There should be no litmus test to be part of this coalition, no litmus test to be working on this cause because of someone's views on Israel or Zionism. That's exactly what we want. And I think Manbani should have been commended about that. Other than that, I thought, what Elliot said, he had every right to say here, even where he explicitly called on Jews not to vote for Mamdani, on people who cared about Israel not to vote for Mamdani. He had the right to do that. He should have done it in an individual capacity outside the synagogue. Rabbi Hirsch, in his, if you haven't seen it, you should take a look at his video. He didn't actually say how people should vote. He addressed himself to Mamdani, explained why what he said was so painful to the Jewish community, so dangerous to the Jewish community, whatever he believed that could be heard. And I think this is right. This is a criticism. What I would say to Mamdani, whatever you intend, the way you are talking will be heard by people to say that you can use a litmus test or do harm to the Jewish community. And you have to be even clearer, disassociating yourself from anyone who might misunderstand what you are saying. So that's what he did. And he didn't do it in the middle of a service wearing a tallis, etc. I don't know if he was in his study at the temple or it did say identify him as a rabbi of the congregation here. But I thought that was a more appropriate way for a rabbi to say exactly what they want to say, but without conveying that the synagogue is endorsing this or opposing a candidate, etc. We find it's mostly the Christian right who does that. And this administration has said they're not going to enforce the rules against the Christian right, against anyone doing it, but against the Christian right pastors who do that a lot here and end up using, the funds to further that of the synagogue to do it. What it means is that people can make a tax-deductible gift to a synagogue, to a church here, and that money can then be used to spread the message about opposing this candidate or supporting that candidate here. So all of a sudden, you have tax-deductible money in political campaigns, and that's going to bring the FEC in to try and regulate the money, which they're required to do, that is used in campaigns, and that can result in monitoring and auditing in congregations, and it will put rabbis in a position where, hey, Rabbi Cosgrove did this. I want you to impose Mamdani. If you want my $100,000 gift to the congregation this year, I want you to oppose this candidate. Or I'm running for office here. I want you to endorse me. Or if you don't, I'm going to use my friends on the board to get you fired. We had a shield against that because it wasn't allowed. To lift that up and partisanize and divide it. We had enough debates over the rabbi's sermons and the cantor's voice and and how traditional the leadership should be and what our education should be like in the schools without importing the most hyper-partisanized, divisive aspect of American life into our houses of worship here. And I hope Rabbi Cosgrove will take the opportunity to make it clear in the future here the right way to do it, rather than legitimize those who want to turn our pulpits into partisan arenas.
Thank you. Thank you for tackling these difficult and sharing us sharing us with us all your thoughts on these difficult questions. I want to give you the opportunity now, as we conclude, if there's anything you want to leave us with, any final thoughts to share.
The words of Esther, in the book of Esther, perhaps it was for such a time as this, you were placed in a position where you could make the difference of life and death to the Jewish people here. This is the most successful Jewish community in the history of the world. We have unbelievable abilities to mobilize not just ourselves, but through our coalitions, the ability to protect America as the bastion of democracy in the world. Here, if we lose it, it will be a disaster for the Jewish people. And then the notion it will be if we become a right-wing Christian country, the notion that we're going to continue to support Israel the way we have here, I think is a naive kind of assumption. It has been because Israel and America were seen as sharing core values about democracy that was the source of the special relationship between the two. And it really, really needs to be reinforced. And if we care about Israel and democracy in Israel and women's rights and reform and conservative Jewish rights in Israel, and if we want to end Israel being a pariah state, we have to work with those forces that are working to end the occupation, bringing a peaceful resolution to a way that Palestinian national identity can be manifested in a political structure here, and done in a way that will not undermine Israel's security. The longer time goes on, the harder it will get, and the more the world will turn against Israel. If ever there was such a time as this, in which we needed to act for both Israel and America, it's at this moment of our history. And I hope and pray that we, in our generation, will have Esther's strength and Mordecai's wisdom to actually go about shifting our politics in both countries to help our nations be the nations that they can be and they must be, and hopefully they will be, for the sake of the Jewish people and the sake of the world.
Thank you. Thank you again. It's a wonderful, important point to end on, and sharing all your expertise and tackling so many insightful questions that we had from our audience. So thank you for taking the time. And
Always, as I said, anytime I'm part of the Haberman Institute, it's an honor for me to speak to the community that has built up around this extraordinary institution. So thank you. And let's all get to work here. We have a lot to do as Jews. It is for such a time as this here that we're called to stand up proudly and to help make those dreams real.